this was a master performance. The issues that you not only listed but discussed in depth are ones that at NGO Monitor we deal with a lot. We deal with it with students that take our classes. We deal with it in responses. And I can only say that I wish the responses from the NGOs, and we get a lot of them, would have the thought, the depth, the complexity, and the experience that you presented. These are very complex issues. And perhaps it was not the intention at the time, but when I began to work on what became NGO Monitor, 10 years ago, after the Durban conference and after the first claims of a massacre in Jenin in 2002, the first claim was made that was not a Palestinian, was made by Derek Founder of Amnesty International on the BBC, and that legitimized the claim from there. So I would only hope that the responses that we would get will be as, even close to being as thoughtful as yours are. So I thank you again for coming, and I thank Ann Herzberg for really putting a huge amount of effort into this evening, and of course our work together on the book, and everybody else who contributed to this. Before I introduce our panel, I will take the chair's privilege and to make a few comments on these issues. I'm going to start by repeating a few things for emphasis that Professor Hampson said, and then present perhaps, in some cases, a slightly different perspective, or not so slightly, and in some cases also expand the discussion, because I think that it's important to see what NGOs say and do, what fact-finding processes participate and contribute to, as being much part of a much larger political discussion. In fact, Alan Stevens' words are important as to the history of the London Guidelines, which I'll come back to in a minute. The first point that I would make is a reminder, and I think perhaps Dr. Ben-Ari will go into that in more detail, that these organizations, non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, have a short but intensive history. And groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty that were created during the Cold War, that began by focusing on political prisoners, on violations in closed societies and other frameworks, at the end of the Cold War, in a sense, reinvented themselves. And they claimed and have received recognition as experts on the law of armed conflict, human rights, international humanitarian law, and particularly on the complexities of asymmetric warfare, in which missiles are stored and fired from schools, and civilians are routinely used as human shields. They're quoted very widely, usually without independent verification, by journalists, diplomats, and academics. I'm not sparing my colleagues in this process and myself. The claims of NGO officials and in their publications become the basis for legal actions, for procedures and investigations of the International Criminal Court, UN human rights investigations, but also television documentaries, newspaper columns, op-eds, campaigns for boycotts and divestments and sanctions, and many other ramifications. And what we found in NGO Monitor, as we began to look at this in detail, and we've been doing it for about 10 years, is that in many, many cases the evidence is very thin. The NGO experts are not really experts. And the accusations regarding military decisions, the type of technology that's used, weapons technology, and as Professor Hampson said, the language that's used that invokes international law, particularly that very harsh language of war crimes, are often invented, distorted, and manipulated. There are many implications for this. I mentioned the Jenin massacre libel. A colleague of mine, Professor Rephael, and I have gone through over 1,000 pages of publications by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty on the 2006 Lebanon war. It was a long project. We still haven't finished publication, although the case study's in this book. And we've demonstrated how many contradictions there are just among those reports, and then the way they were later on presented, interpreted, and used. The book also includes case studies from Kosovo, Colombia. These are not unique situations, although perhaps I would still say that when it comes to Israel and the Middle East, the standards are even worse than they are universally. So we have to pay much more attention to the way that the language is used, and the fact that journalists, diplomats, academics will often accept the claims that are made, both in terms of fact-finding and in terms of legal interpretation, as if they were made by experts. The history, in our view, my view, has seriously damaged the credibility of the universal principles of human rights. These are important, and it's not simply a matter of warning of an imminent genocidal situation. It's Rwanda. These are day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month claims, and there are vast differences. There is time to go back and check to see what happened in Cana on July 31st in Lebanon 2006, before a massive publication campaign, a press conference, which basically led to the situation in which the Prime Minister of Israel, without having any knowledge of what happened, called for a 48-hour, imposed a 48-hour ceasefire and air operations, which one could argue can contribute to the lengthening of the war and more casualties as a result. There should be far more attention paid to who the people are that are writing these reports. And I do think methodology is important. How are the eyewitness testimonies, which constitute so much of the substance of these reports? Pages after pages are based on eyewitness testimony. How are those examined? And if we don't know anything about the questions that were asked and the details of the process, then how can we, as consumers, whether it's journalists or academics or others or governments, examine the reliability, the credibility of the claims? There's the example of Mark Orlasco, who had the title of Senior Military Analyst at Human Rights Watch. He was widely accepted as an expert. I debated him on Canadian broadcasting. He appeared on, I didn't debate him, but he appeared on a number of other, across the board, during the Gaza War in particular, as an expert, as a military expert. He was always introduced as a military expert, and yet his military background, his capabilities were very unclear. And that was before the discovery of his obsessive collection of Nazi memorabilia. When these questions were raised, Human Rights Watch actually promised that his reports would be investigated. But a year after these reports surfaced, he quietly left Human Rights Watch, signed a secrecy agreement. There was no independent investigation. So I would question whether this reflects an NGO trying to do its best, whether this is really good faith action. I'm not saying at all that all NGO reports fit into that category. There are very important differences. But very often, the more blatant examples, and these are very powerful organizations, they often do have resources which are greater than those of states. I think that the Israeli Foreign Ministry would be happy to have something like the $40 million that Human Rights Watch has, the well over 100 million pounds that Amnesty International has for its budgets. And I'm not saying these are all focused on Israel, but then you add up the numbers of the huge size of budgets and the number of people that are dedicated to focusing just on allegations against Israel, it does make a difference to have those kinds of resources. And so I think that is the basis for publication of the book. That the kind of standards and guidelines, and particularly the Lund-Luden guidelines that Alan Stevens first alerted us to, and became the basis for a lot of our work. And the fact that those appear to have been, I won't say abandoned, but not picked up by the international community that should be concerned about this, led very much to the basis for this book, for this evening, for these discussions. Perhaps in the future, there will be much greater attention to these and other guidelines. When the Israeli government debated participation, particularly in the Goldstone report, the absence of guidelines, and the blatant difference between the impartiality and careful attention to details and methodology that were required, that would have been required had the London guidelines been adopted, were completely absent. We look at the UN Palmer Commission as a different example. Their investigation in the 2010 flotilla incident used a very different methodology, and the Israeli government participated and cooperated. Members of the NGO networks, as well as those who rely on their reports, would do well to learn from this history and to engage with constructive critics, and we consider NGO Monitor to be very much in that category. It's a way of restoring the credibility and the moral foundations of NGOs and human rights. And if this book, this evening, your important keynote address and the comments of our panel contribute to that, then we will have done our job. I'm going to introduce our panel members now. I am not going to be give them the full introductions that they all deserve, because each one has a great deal of accomplishments in his and her own right. I'm going to briefly list a couple of highlights. I'm going to do them all now so that each panelist can come up and speak without me interrupting in the middle. Our first speaker is Dr. Rephael Ben-Ari, a recent PhD, a year ago, I guess, at Ilan University. He's got a very distinguished academic and professional career, Leiden University in Holland in public international law, first degree at Tel Aviv University. He was the legal advisor when we first met to the Israeli embassy in The Hague, and just has come back from a year as a as a member of the faculty or postdoctoral fellow at NYU University's Hauser Global Law Program. He's the author of The Normative Position of International Non-Governmental Organizations under International Law, an analytical framework, which I had the privilege of reading as it was being written. And hopefully we'll have an evening also dedicated to the importance of that book. And he'll be our first speaker. Our second speaker, it was probably a little bit longer than the others, doctoral student I always give extra time to. Sigall Horovitz is completing a PhD. You'll get more time when you're finished. In law, specializing in transitional justice at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She also heads the Transitional Justice Project of the Minerva Center for Human Rights at Hebrew University. She completed her LLM with honors at Columbia University. And she's had a very, very intense direct involvement. First as legal advisor to the president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzania, and also as the officer of at the office of the prosecutor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Colonel Liron Libman, out of uniform, I think for one of the first times I've seen you, has recently completed 23 years, really at the focus of the Israeli military's effort to deal with these issues. In the Military Advocate General's unit in the IDF, he served as the head of the International Law Department, and he had to deal with many of the issues that were raised during that period, particularly the fact-finding reports on the Gaza operation. I guess in parentheses we call it the Goldstone Report, among others. There was also the report to the International Criminal Court of the Arab League and others. And then afterwards, as an encore, he had to deal with the Gaza flotilla incident and many other frameworks. He had a very distinguished career before that. He's got his law degree from Bar-Ilan University. I'm glad to see there's a good representation here. And then got a master's in law from Hebrew University, magna cum laude, and has done made many other major participations. Our final speaker is going to be Professor Robbie Sabel, Professor of International Law, also Ambassador. I'm never sure where it's like Rabbi and Doctor. But first, Ambassador and Professor of International Law, teaching at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He served as the Counselor for Political Affairs at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, a number of other senior positions, the legal advisor for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, not Foreign Control, and was also involved, we've met many times when he was involved in disarmament as the head of the Israeli delegation involved in the Taba arbitration, and also a very distinguished publication record. Again, I'm not doing a fair job in introducing all of our speakers. They all have distinguished careers, but I'd rather give them the time to make the presentation.